Darren, thanks for the introduction. Whatever he told you, I want you to know I'm deaf on my right ear, and I have only 40% hearing on my left ear, so I didn't hear what he had said. But anyway, you may wonder, who am I? Well, I am a retired country doctor from the Chicago area. And I retired at the age of 75. I'm now 91 years old. And if I'm not loud enough and I speak in a raspy voice, you have to forgive me. I'm probably the oldest in this place. And I just came back from Poland, from my hometown, which is southern Poland, and I was the oldest man there. Now, there are very few people left that could tell you as an eyewitness of what had transpired during World War II that is referred to as the Holocaust. And it's important for everyone, especially the young, to know about it, because if you don't know it and you don't care, it may happen again. Now, I may sound sometimes as a preacher rather than a speaker. I am not a historian, I'm not a researcher, I'm just a country doctor who was making house calls, who was getting up in the middle of the night to see people in the intensive care unit, who worked on Saturdays, Sundays, 24 hours a day. But at times I may sound like a preacher, and there would be nothing unusual about it, because my grandmother, when I was 4 years old, thought that I was going to be the grandest rabbi anywhere in the world. Because at that age, I could recite the Bible, and I could recite all the prayers by heart. But she will, of course, be very disappointed if she sees me now. My cousins who survived the war had told me that. Anyway, I'm here to tell you what I have experienced. My name is Alexander B. White, that you saw in the announcement. And you may wonder, what is the B and what is the white in a man with this accent? Well, the B is my old name, and it stood for Białe Włos. That is a difficult to pronounce name. It means white hair in translation from Polish. So you get white, just like this gentleman, and a few others, and you lose your hair. So I am white without the hair. Anyway, you may wonder many times, why should you hear me out? After all, this is the United States of America. We have Jeffersonian democracy. We have a Bill of Rights, we have a Constitution. A Hitler and a Stalin wouldn't have a chance here. Well, I want you to know that especially Germany, prior to Hitler's ascent to power, January 30th, 1933, had a constitution as well, very similar to the American Constitution. It guaranteed the rights of all the people and so on. But a constitution, a Bill of Rights, is just a piece of paper on which it is written. To Hitler, it meant nothing. He tore it up, threw it in the garbage. So we have also a Constitutional Bill of Rights, but it needs the people. It needs me, you, and especially the young people to guarantee the provisions of those rights. If you're not there to guard those provisions, it is absolutely meaningless. You can take it with you to the toilet. Anyway, so that's what I am here to speak to about my own experience. But before I tell you that, I would like to see you a small strip, just 6 minutes, a visual presentation, the only one available in the entire world, from photos taken by the Nazi guards themselves illegally. They would have gone to jail if they would have found out that these men took photos. This was supposed to be a top secret. No one was supposed to take photos, but fortunately it was found by one of the prisoners after liberation, when she stuck her hand into a coat that one of the guys left because she was cold. She found those photos, and a brief film was made of it. But it is something that you will never forget. I wasn't there, but I thought that you may want to see it.
Auschwitz-Birkenau was the largest extermination center created by the Nazis. It has become the symbol of the Holocaust and of willful radical evil in our time. The album you will see presented here is known as the Auschwitz Album, and it is the only surviving visual evidence of the process of mass murder at Auschwitz-Birkenau. The album is unique. There is not a similar album of its kind in the entire world. It documents, in photos from every direction and from every angle, the arrival at Auschwitz, the selection of those slated for immediate death, and of the few who were destined to be slave laborers, the confiscation of their property, and the preparation for the physical annihilation of a transport of Jewish people. This transport of Hungarian Jews from the area of Carpatho-Ruthenia arrived at the ramp of the extermination camp Auschwitz-Birkenau in May 1944. In the photos, we see the men, women, and children step out of the overcrowded train, traumatized and fearful after their horrendous journey. They have no clue that they have just been delivered to a death factory, and that few of them will survive. Survivor and Nobel Peace Prize laureate Elie Wiesel described his arrival as a teenager at Auschwitz. Every yard or so, an SS man held his gun trained on us. Hand in hand, we followed the crowd. Men to the left, women to the right. 8 words spoken, indifferently, without emotion. 8 short, simple words. For a part of a second, I glimpsed my mother and my sister moving to the right. I saw them disappear into the distance, while I walked on with my father and the other men. I did not know that at that place, at that moment, I was parting from my mother and my sister forever. The selection process carried out by SS doctors and wardens took place 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, as train after train unloaded its human cargo. Most Jews were sent immediately to the left, to their death. The undressing rooms of the gas chambers were not sufficient for the masses of Hungarian Jews who arrived daily in the summer of 1944. They therefore had to wait until the undressing rooms were ready to absorb them. The common waiting place was the grove closest to the crematorium that would soon turn their bodies to ash. They were told to sit among the trees and wait for further instructions. These were their last peaceful moments together before being driven into the gas chambers and murdered. It has been said that there will never be people as innocent as the victims on the threshold of the gas chambers. The SS kept the victims destined for gassing in complete ignorance of what lay in store for them. They were told that before being placed in the camp, they had to be disinfected and washed. They would soon discover that what they had assumed were the shower areas were actually hermetically sealed gas chambers. A minority of Jews was selected for forced labor. Their personal belongings were confiscated, their hair was shaved, and a registration number was tattooed on their left arm. In the words of survivor and author Primo Levi, "For the first time we became aware that our language lacks words to express this offense, the demolition of a man. It is not possible to sink lower than this. Nothing belongs to us anymore. They have taken away our clothes, our shoes, even our hair. If we speak, they will not listen to us, and if they listen, they will not understand. They will even take away our name, and if we want to keep it, we will have to find in ourselves the strength to do so. It is in this way that one can understand the double sense of the term extermination camp." The work of sorting the possessions that the Jews brought with them to Auschwitz was done by Jewish prisoners who were forced to collect the packages and sort the items that would then be sent to the Reich. By the time the sorting was completed, most of the previous owners were already dead. No memory of the men, women, and children that were deemed valueless upon their arrival remains in camp records. This album is the sole witness to their fate. The Auschwitz Album was discovered after the war by Lily Jacob, a survivor of the transport pictured here. Lily gave the album to Yad Vashem, where she knew that its tragic contents would be safeguarded for posterity and shared with generations to come.
Been in Auschwitz, could have been in Majdanek or some other extermination camp. Again, my family, we were a family of four. My two parents, four of us children. The oldest was my sister. She was 1 year older than I. I was 16 when the war broke out. I had a younger brother 2 years younger than I, and the youngest was 8 years old in 1939 when the war broke out. None survived. They were all murdered, and I was the only survivor of that family. So I'm going to tell you very briefly what I experienced. And if you will have two survivors speak to you, you will find that they all have one thing in common. They all lost their entire families, or nearly the entire families. I only know one family, a single family, that survived in total. But each one of our experiences varies, sometimes quite a bit. Mine is more benign than anybody else's, owing to the fact that my father was a craftsman. And we had a shop in that small town of 16,000 population, and the Germans needed us. We had to fix their windows. We had their trucks and cars had broken windows on the Polish roads, which were not highways like Hitler had built before he started the war. So we were extremely busy, and we were left relatively alone.
Auschwitz-Birkenau was the largest extermination center created
must
by
have
the
touched
Nazis.
something.
It has become the symbol of the Holocaust and of willful radical evil in our time. The album you will see presented here is known as the Auschwitz Album, and it is the only surviving visual evidence of the process of mass murder at Auschwitz-Birkenau.
I must have touched the wrong thing. Anyway, so my story is relatively benign as compared to others, some of the survivors from my hometown, which are very few, because most of those that survived from my hometown were in Siberia, because they managed to escape more eastward than my family managed to escape, which came under Stalin's rule, and they took all the people from the west and took them to Siberia, which is another aspect of the Holocaust that you can find in a book that I translated. A neighbor of ours, and she had the guts to put down a diary every single day of their trip to northern Siberia. About 500,000 Polish citizens were dragged from the west to Siberia that managed to escape to the Soviet part of Poland, including a number of my cousins, aunts, uncles, and they survived, although they lost 1/3 of that 500,000 due to the conditions that prevailed there. Now, they weren't even aware of what went on in our area because it wasn't advertised. It was nowhere. They had plenty of communist papers, but there wasn't a word about it. And the lady whose diary I translated from Polish into English, only in the last day in 1945 did she find out that her daughters with grandchildren that she had left in our town because they could not run and escape were all murdered, and there was no one alive. They had no idea. And the same was true in the United States. The government knew. There's no question about it, because the New York Times had some notes of the killings that were taking place, but it was put in the last page in a short little note. In the first page is one lady who had researched it on television I saw, said, and the front page was the sale of shoes. That's the way it was. Anyway, my first experience of mass killing of innocent people came only a few days after the Nazis invaded the 1st of September 1939. Everyone tried to escape eastward, hoping that the Allies, which is the British and the French, will start shooting in the west as they promised Poland, but they did not. And Hitler outsmarted all of them when he approached Stalin, his arch enemy, and offered him half of Poland and become friends. And those people, if they have something to gain together, they go to sleep in the same bed. And Hitler was excited. He accepted it, and they became friends. So now people try to escape eastward. We were on our way, but we got stuck in a small town near my hometown where we heard that the German army was already behind us, very fast. So we stopped in that little town, and my dad said, we are not going any further. There's no sense running. So we stayed in this little town to the northeast from my hometown. We stayed with a glazier because we were in the glass glazing and the beveling of glass business, and he used to buy glass from us. So we stayed in his little house, which was just a kitchen and a bedroom. And he allowed us to stay in that kitchen. We slept on the floor and so on. And within about 2 days, the first unit of the German army arrived. They set up their field kitchen in the center of town, and they behaved very decently. They behaved very much like my parents had the experience of World War I, where they were kind, they were nice, they were quartered in Jewish homes because the Jewish language is a dialect of German, so they could communicate with one another. And officers and soldiers in the German army who were Jewish were collecting money for those Eastern European poor Jews. So here they come in and they hand out cigarettes, candy, very nice. I stood there, I watched them. I envied them. I wish I was one of them. That lasted only 24 hours. When my father and a number of people from my hometown who managed to escape to that little town saw how they behaved, they decided to go back home because we left everything wide open. We just ran. But he wanted my mom and us children to stay there until he ascertains that it is safe to come home. And he will send for us. So we stayed there. After he left, a unit of the SS followed and entered this little town, while the military unit moved to the east to meet with the Soviets at the demarcation line along the Sun River, which was only 40 kilometers away to the east from our town. That SS unit, the minute they entered, it is referred to as the Sonderkommando unit in German. That means a special commando unit of SS, whose function was to arrest Polish intellectuals, Polish patriots, and anyone that's going to be unhappy or might oppose their rule. But when it came to Jewish people, they ordered everyone, male, between the ages of 16 and 60, to immediately show up in the central square. And whoever is going to be caught that had not shown up is going to be shot on the spot. Now, there was a commotion going on outside. The windows were closed. We weren't allowed to open the windows or to walk out. And we heard this crying and screaming as young people were already marching out to the central square. Their wife and their children were crying and so on. And when my mom heard all that, she put us around the table in the kitchen and gave each one of us a book to read, to appear like we are busy studying. We don't know what goes on outside. All of a sudden, an SS man, I can still see him today, tall guy, kicked the door open with his boot, his revolver in the outstretched arm, and he said, "All men out." My mother, who knew German, because that area was Galicia, it was Austria, before the end of World War I, told him that I was 14 years old. The order was 16 to 60, so he let me stay. But in the room next door was the local kid, 16. He didn't ask any questions. He told him to go out to the central square. We did not find out what happened in the central square until early the following morning. Needless to say, we did not sleep that night. And within an hour, we saw flames coming from the direction where the Jewish synagogue was. So we were certain that they put that to the torch. And we heard crying and screaming and shooting again. Anyway, early in the morning, we had a knock on the kitchen door. My mom went to answer it, and there's this little boy, that 16-year-old kid, all bloodied, crying, describing what happened. They lined up 200, some of them. The number I know from the Polish investigation of Nazi crimes. I have that book at home, how many people were there. They marched them out to a ravine just outside the square, lined them up, and all of a sudden they started machine gunning them, shooting them. When that youngster heard the shooting, he passed out and he fell into the ravine. The dead and the wounded fell on him, but he wasn't hit. So he lay there until the shooting stopped, and when they were gone, he worked his way out and came to tell us that story. This was an amazing to us and to me, a young teenager, how anyone can come into a town and take innocent people and just simply shoot them. But this was too pale as to what occurred during the Holocaust that you had seen here. Within minutes, another man knocked on the door. And here was a man from my hometown, whom I knew very well. He had a bike store. I used to rent my bike from him, Mr. Shamroth, and he had a bullet wound in his chest. And I remember my mom put a towel around him and all that. He was shot, but he survived. And he also crawled out of that mass grave. Now, this was September 1939. Well, to make a long story short, because I'm supposed to speak no longer than about an hour, we eventually got home. My dad sent us a note that in my hometown it was relatively quiet. So we went back home, and as soon as we arrived, a man from my hometown, a Jewish man, older than I, came over. Mr. Palant was his name. And he told us the order is that we all Jews must leave that town and go over to the Soviet side, which was 40 kilometers away. So we took our stuff, put it back on the wagon. We're going to go east. When a Gestapo man, the Gestapo headquarters was right across the road, across the street actually, from our shop and where we lived. And he came over to my father and he says, Glasermeister, you cannot go. We need you here. So we took our bundles and went into our little apartment. Mr. Palant had to leave, and other Jews had to leave. And believe it or not, if they did not return eventually, they survived in Siberia. But we stayed here on the German side. Now, that was 1939. As you know, all Nuremberg laws were put into effect. Jews lost all their businesses, and my father was smart enough to have an ethnic German, in other words, a Polish citizen of German descent. They were called Volksdeutsche, in contrast to Reichsdeutsche from the Reich. But they had all the same privileges. And this particular one had been a neighbor of my uncle, my father's brother, in a neighboring town. And he had a little note from my uncle that we should give him our business because he may protect us when we work for him. So we gave it to him. And we were very busy because the German cars had broken windows. The military were quartered in all schools. Schools were closed for everybody. And they had broken windows there. All of this had to be fixed. And the air base was going to be expanded into a German air base. So that had to be fixed. So we were very busy. And that was to our advantage because there were always German cars in front of our shop that we worked. And the German soldiers, I must tell you, some people may not like what I say, some Jewish people, they were very nice. They were friendly. They gave you a tip. They gave you a loaf of bread. So we had it better than anyone in our town. they would give you some German marks, and German marks were just as valuable as dollars after the war in Europe. So we were better off. But all other people who did not work for Germans had to go out and clean the latrines, clean the streets, and do all kinds of menial work, and it made no difference whether you were a Nobel Prize winner or a physician. You had to do all of that. So we were better off. 1939 passed, 1940 came, and we were continually very busy. And, of course, there was hunger. But we were again better off, because for generations we lived in that little town, and peasants knew us. So if they needed any glass or putty or any of these things, they would come and they would bring you a chicken, they would bring you some flour, and so on. So we were better off. But there was hunger all over, including the peasants who were at the farms, because they had to deliver all their products to the Germans. And if they did not, they landed up in Auschwitz. Auschwitz was a concentration camp not for Jews at that time, only for Poles at that time, who were either in the underground or did not deliver their products, and so on. A lady from my hometown just sent me a Polish book that she's putting together from interviews that she interviewed peasants, Polish peasants. And it's amazing to see the peasants who had all kinds of food products that they produced, but they were sent to jail if they did not deliver. So it was universal. I will never forget, in 1939, Hanukkah, which was in December, you make potato patties, and fat was impossible to get. So men from the mines, the oil mines, there were oil mines in our area, brought a bottle of paraffin fat. And she tried to make those pancakes. Well, it was pure kerosene. There was just no way anyone could eat it. It was difficult to get food. But America wasn't yet at war. So the Jewish community, of whom my father was one, and he was part of the people who were social services, started a kitchen. And America was still sending support, so we had a kitchen, and we fed the people twice a day soup. But once America entered the war, that stopped. So there was hunger and sickness and so on. So I'm speaking of 1939. I go to 1940, and as you know from history, that in 1940, Hitler decided, since the Allies didn't do one thing, and since he was friends with Stalin, he could move all his troops to the West and get rid of them, which he did. And within 5 weeks, as you know, France was gone. The British expeditionary force of close to 500,000 people with the equipment barely escaped, but without the equipment. And he then marched north all the way to near the North Pole in Norway, then turned south. Now, Stalin became upset because he marched into Yugoslavia and to the Slavic countries that he wasn't supposed to. So we knew immediately that something was going to happen there, because all of a sudden we saw graffiti on German trucks, on the trains, against the Soviets. And I heard the radio every day, not that we had radios, but the German soldiers and officers who came to us, their radios were blaring in their cars. And there was a stormtrooper living above our shop that blared all the time. And all of a sudden you hear, whereas before it was the Jews in London and Washington that have declared war on Germany, and so on, and in order to kill all Germans. But he promised that all Jews will be killed. Now, all of a sudden, it's not anymore the Jews in London and Washington. Now it is in London and Moscow, London and Washington. All three. The Jews in all these places, the enemies of Germany, just want to kill all Germans. So we knew something was going to happen, and it did. June 22nd, 1941, I was again awakened, very much like the 1st of September, at the airbase, planes flying sorties all the way eastward, bombing the Soviet positions in the east. And the war against the Soviet Union had started. Now, as they entered those areas very rapidly, as you know, within 6 weeks, they had Leningrad surrounded. By the first week of December, they were in Moscow, on the outskirts of Moscow. They ran just as fast through the Soviet Union as they did through Poland, through France. And now, as they entered the eastern part of Poland, where many of the Jewish people had escaped to and managed to avoid being dragged to Siberia by Stalin, very few of them. But the local Jewish people were not dragged to Siberia. As they entered there, they now had quite a few of those special commando units to kill Jews. So Jewish people were killed by the tens of thousands. In some places, 90,000. In some places, 50,000. Near Kiev, at Babi Yar, which was memorialized by the Ukrainian poet Yevtushenko, or it would have been forgotten, close to 40,000 Jewish people were killed. And now, not anymore males between the ages of 16 and 60, but women, children, everybody. It was amazing. We heard that. But where we were under German occupation, this did not occur. There was sporadic killing of somebody if they caught you without the armband, but mass killing wasn't there. But we heard it when cousins of mine who managed to escape there now smuggled their way back to the German-occupied part, where it was relatively quiet yet, and they described the killings over there that they escaped from. So now comes December 1941, and the Japanese decide to bomb Pearl Harbor on the 7th of December, and Hitler elated. I could hear that over their radios. Oh, he was in the seventh heaven. He now thought he won the war. He was already in Moscow, in the suburbs there. He had practically the entire continent of Europe. He thought the war was going to come to an end. But his armies encountered the Russian winter, just like Napoleon did. And his entire mechanized army ground to a halt. Cars wouldn't start. The soldiers were freezing. They were not prepared for the winter because Hitler thought that he will be finished with Stalin by Christmas, and they will all be back home celebrating Christmas. Well, that was not the case. That gave them rest. In our town, since the Germans didn't have warm clothes, they ordered all Jewish people in the German-occupied area to deliver everything that's made out of wool and everything that's made out of fur within 24 hours. And if whoever's going to be found that had not done it is going to be shot on the spot. My father, who was a member of the Jewish community elders, they were all called to the Gestapo and given that order. And I remember that evening so well because we were right across from the Gestapo headquarters. I saw them go up there. I even saw my father's back of the head through the window being up there. And my father came down. We were scared to death. We didn't know whether they're going to be killed or whatever. When he came down about a half an hour later, told us about that order. And he also told us that he overheard a Gestapo man from a neighboring town tell the chief of Gestapo, Hauptsturmführer Schmatzler, whom I knew every Gestapo man. They came to our shop all the time for this, for that. Told him in German, knallen Sie einige weg. That means knock a few off. And indeed, the following day, about a dozen Jewish people were shot. Supposedly, they found something made out of wool on them, a shawl, a glove, or whatever not. Of course, that wasn't true, because we gave them everything, every stocking that was full of holes, anything we gave them, because we were afraid. And that was my second experience of killing people, supposedly because they didn't deliver the woolens and their furs at the time. Now, that was December 1941. Then came January 1942. A German gentleman from the air base who bought glass in our place, came and he wanted to speak to my dad. And in secret. And he tells my dad that he heard from officers at the air base that by the end of 1942, there's not supposed to be a single Jewish individual alive, according to the order of Heinrich Himmler, the chief killer. And we didn't believe him. Not at all. But we already heard that gas chambers were being built. But these were all rumors that no one wanted to believe. And then we heard about ghettos being established in Krakow and Warsaw already in 1941, in the big cities. In our city, no. But it came to us in August of 1942 when we were ordered, all Jewish people, alive, children and babies and everybody, must show up near the railroad station for so-called resettlement. Now we already knew from the big cities what resettlement meant. Many Jewish people had Aryan false papers, so they traveled. And it was dangerous, but they did. So these rumors got around. So come August 1942, we are supposed to show up at the railroad station on the 9th of August, 1942. Now, we knew already from the big cities that women and children are supposedly useless to the Germans, that they are going to be the first victims. But if you are strong and healthy, you might stay. So we hid my mother and my sister and my little brother, and we men went out there. To describe to you the scene going out there is humanly impossible. The crying, the weeping, the pushing ulsters and wheelbarrows, carrying them on their shoulders, children crying, babies, people in wheelchairs. Unbelievable sight. We got out there. We men got out there. This place was surrounded with machine guns, just like you saw in Auschwitz. And we had to line up. Then they took out, they had all kinds of Gestapo men there, not from our town, including those from our town. And they shoved them off to a corner. And where you saw whom they shoved into that corner, you knew immediately that they are going to be the first victims, because those are the ones that they brought in on their shoulders. Those were elderly women, men, and invalids, and so on. And the scenes are unbelievable, as daughters or sons wanted to join their parents. They could see that they are going to be killed, but they would rather share their fate with their loved ones than stay. And the beating was unbelievable as they forced them to get back in line. Why they were doing this is difficult for me even today to understand, since they were all doomed anyway. They called out names. They called out our name. We are going back to the ghetto. We are important for the economy. So my father, I, a cousin of mine who was a tool and die maker, and another relative who worked with us in our glass business, we were to go back. He had his wife and 2 babies hidden also. We had, of course, our family hidden. Went back to the ghetto. Life wasn't anymore the same. We still walked out to go to work in our shop, which was outside the ghetto, and the owner was that ethnic German. But it wasn't anymore. 2 weeks later, I was sent to work in a refinery near my hometown. When I came back, my father was sitting in a chair crying, tearing his hair out. And a cousin of mine, the tool and die maker, tried to cheer him up. And I don't see my mom, and I don't see my sister. I knew immediately something horrible had happened. And I found out that the Gestapo announced that those that were hidden the first time around in August, if they would voluntarily show up, they would be given permission to stay. So they, tired of hiding, went out. But instead, trucks arrived. They forced them on trucks and took them away. I had to find out what happened to them. I went to see the stormtrooper the following morning, and I knew him. And I told him he has to help me find my mom and my sister. And he told me, you are coming too late. He was a dispatcher of trucks. And he said the Gestapo ordered trucks that afternoon into the ghetto. So if I had come the day before, he would have told me not to let my mom and my sister out. It was too late. And these were the first victims in my own family, my mother and my sister. So now, life was not anymore the same. We went to the shop, but we were more hiding there than working. Then came the order of final resettlement. No one is supposed to stay anymore in town. We have to show up on a Friday morning, on the 4th of December. We have to show up on the street of the ghetto for final resettlement. Now we knew that that's the end, so we decided to slip out of the ghetto, went to our shop, where there was a cellar, and we hid in that cellar. And there was I, my little brother, Mr. Heller with his wife Rachel and 2 babies, and we were sitting in that cellar all night. Early in the morning, Mr. Heller says, we will go out on the street, take some tools with him as if going to work, and find out what's going on the street. He goes out, comes right back. He said that little ghetto street is surrounded with machine guns, very much like near the railroad station, very much what you saw here. Now we didn't know what to do. We thought we are going to wait for the ethnic German to come and open the shop. He opens the shop about half an hour later. We crawl out of that basement, and he wonders what we are doing there in the winter with little babies. Well, he said, you can't stay here, but he's willing to go into the ghetto, speak to the Gestapo to find out whether we are going to stay in town. He goes, comes back with a Gestapo man. As I told you, I knew every one of them. This guy's name was Oscar Becker. Oscar Becker comes and he says, you follow me into the ghetto. We followed him there. All Jewish people already lined up, 300 some that were left of the few thousand that were originally so-called resettled to the gas chambers of Belositz. So he tells us, go into your apartment, get yourself something out and line up. So we lined up. Anyone that came after us was shot right against the wall. Every single one. And there was shooting going on in the houses as they were going from house to house trying to find people. I'm not going to tell you some incidences because it's getting late, so I'm not going to tell you. But one, the lady, Mrs. Presser, who was our neighbor, and I knew which house she was in, and she was wheelchair bound, and she had been hidden the first time around. And I saw a Gestapo man enter that house, and I hear a scream and a shot. And I was certain that Mrs. Presser was shot, and she was shot. Her 3 sons, who are our neighbors, were in Siberia. They managed to escape to the east. Anyway, we were sent to the air base. We were at, oh, by the way, as soon as they marched people out to the train station, including my little brother and my cousin, who could have gone with us to the air base, but the Gestapo chief said he's too young, they cannot let him go. And my cousin had a little boy, Michael, he couldn't go either. So my cousin said he will take my little brother with him, because the chief of the Gestapo came over and we pleaded with him to let my little brother go with us. And he said, no, I can't let him because he's too young. But I promise you, he said, I promise you they are not going to go up there. They are going to a larger ghetto where they are going to be there, and you will be able to communicate with them from the air base. Now, he told us the truth. They did go to a larger ghetto, and they were there. And we were at the air base. We were at the air base the entire year of 1943. What transpired in that ghetto where they were, we did not know. All I could find out is that the ghetto there was liquidated sometime in the summer of 1943. And I'm certain that my cousin and his little boy Michael and my brother probably perished either in Auschwitz or in one of the other extermination camps at that time. My younger brother, 2 years younger, was sent to a neighboring ghetto to clean up after the Jews there and ship everything to Germany. He was there. And we knew that he was there because he would ever so often throw a little note into a mailbox through somebody to send it to somebody that we knew who would come to the airbase, who was hauling sand at the airbase. So we knew that he was there. But February 1943, the Germans lost Stalingrad. And that was the beginning of the end. And all of a sudden, we didn't hear from my brother anymore. So I didn't find out until about 40 years after the war from a girl that was with me at Schindler's camp. And I knew she was with my brother. And I knew that she knows, but she would not tell me. She told me she doesn't know. One day he wasn't there. Anyway, he was shot there, I found out. She finally told me. So there was strictly my father and myself and Mr. Heller. the husband of Rachel with the two babies, who was brought back as they walked out of the ghetto, and a Gestapo man took his revolver and shot her and the two babies in her arms, just in front of me, just yards away. It was an unbelievable sight. An innocent young woman, she was in her early 20s with two babies. Anyway, her husband, Mr. Heller, was with me and my father, and we were sent to Krakow, Płaszów at the end of 1943, when the Soviets were coming close to Poland, and the entire airbase had to be moved to the east. And we were sent from one concentration camp near my hometown, which had been a prisoner of war camp for Soviet prisoners of war. There were over 5,000 of them there. They took them all out and shot all of them and made it into a concentration camp for Poles and Jews there. Then they shipped those off to Auschwitz and shot a few thousand right in the villages nearby. And we were sent there to clean up after them. So we cleaned up. We were 124 people from the airbase, and then shipped to Krakow. In Krakow, there was a selection referred to as the Naked Parade. It was in May of 1944, before what you saw Hungarian Jews. The Hungarian Holocaust didn't start until about summer of 1944, when the Nazis in Hungary overthrew Admiral Horthy, who would not deliver the Jews. They took over and they delivered them. So that selection, referred to as the Naked Parade, took place the middle of May 1944, where we all had to undress naked and walk by a desk where a Obersturmführer, a physician, his name was Blanke, Dr. Blanke, was sitting there, and he pointed out who is to go to Auschwitz and who is to stay in that camp. And I was to stay in the camp, and both my father and Mr. Heller, the husband of Rachel with the babies that were shot, were to go to Auschwitz. And my father knew what that meant. He knew that he would survive that day, because Auschwitz was only less than an hour away from Krakow, Płaszów. So he turned to me, and he told me that he doesn't care to live anymore, because, as he said, if I live another 10 years, I will consume another ton of potatoes. In other words, he would just be vegetating, eating like an animal. He had lost the entire family. I was the only one that was still alive. And he told me, he said he has one request of me. He hopes that I will survive this ordeal. And if I do, just do me one single favor. Please be a Mensch. Now, what is a Mensch? A Mensch is a human being. But if a parent tells you to be a Mensch, it means be an exceptional human being. We are all human beings. Be kind, be charitable, don't be intolerant, don't bully, as I tell kids in high schools, other kids, don't join some fringe groups like skinheads, neo-Nazis, and God knows what else. That's all included in Be a Mensch. It's a universal message. Of course, we have many such messages. We have 10 Commandments, we have a Bill of Rights, we have a Constitution, we have all kinds of these. But this is a universal message that includes everything. And I tell kids from high school, throwing garbage on the street, starting fights, all of this should not be done if you are a Mensch. And that's why, if you call me a preacher, that's what I am preaching. And that's what I am here for. And that's why I go to schools to speak and to institutions, is just be a Mensch, a universal message. And when I wrote my memoirs, about 40-some years later, I looked for a title, and I thought that would be the best title, Be a Mensch. And I was from there sent to open the mass graves in Krakow to incinerate all the corpses that were there that had been shot in Krakow. I got my nose broken there. I was bleeding from my nose. I had decomposed matter in my eyes and my nose as I was bending down to lift a corpse. And to me, that corpse was just like a living human being. I was afraid that I would hit with a shovel the corpse. So I tried to get underneath to lift that corpse up. It was a redhead. Whenever I see a redhead, I think of that corpse. And there was a baby next to that corpse. And a capo, a criminal German capo, who was supervising, and he was in that mass grave, and his boots were full of decomposed matter, kicked me full blast in my face, and I had all this stuff in my mouth, in my nose, in my ears. It was a horrible experience, but I survived it. About a month later, I was assigned to be shipped out because the Soviets were already near Krakow. So we were shipped out gradually to Germany, and I was shipped into Mr. Schindler's camp. I heard about Mr. Schindler when I was in Krakow, and I knew two girls whom I knew from the ghetto who worked there for him in Krakow. And I met them when I got to Sudetenland. That's where his factory was. And that's where I was liberated May 8th, 1945. I think I'm already far behind, so I'm going to stop. If you have any questions, I'll be glad to expand and explain. But anyway, my next problem was, what am I going to do now? I have no family. I have no money. I am in Germany at the time, so what am I going to do now? Well, I decided that being a Mensch means make something out of yourself, to be useful to mankind, in addition not to be a horrible individual. And I went, I signed up at the university, I studied, I graduated, I came to the United States, I served in the Army, I was discharged captain of the United States Medical Corps, and then taught at the medical school in Chicago and worked in private practice, and here I am to tell you all of this. So all I want to do is just remember this one thing. Be a Mensch. Be a decent human being. Okay, and I will quit. Thank you for hearing me out. So.